Good evening, everyone. I'm Kyle with Andrew Hilton, and welcome to our Friday night live interactive virtual wine tasting. It's a busy old night in the store, as you can probably overhear. We had some folks in the shop just doing a little bit of shopping before the snow shuts us all down and makes us hide in our homes for the weekend. So this is going to be, I think, the most technical and interesting tasting. We have maps. We have the world's jankiest fake bottle of sherry that I made about half an hour ago. We have diagrams. I made notes. This is going to be a lot of fun. So let's talk about what sherry is and why it's important. So let's start by getting a little bit of wine in our glasses. Now, we are going to start with the Pepe, Fino, and Rama. And we are just going to pour a little bit of that in our glasses. We don't need a whole lot. The alcohol in this is quite high, up at 15% alcohol. And that 15% number is going to become real important as we go along. So let's talk about what sherry is. Sherry is a fortified wine. Now, that includes a whole category of wines. Mac van de Jura, port, sherry, Madeira, Marsala, some of the really delicious Muscat wines from Iberia included, as well as some of the ones in Australia and South Africa. Not Tokai Azu though. Tokai Azu, a lot of people might think is a fortified wine because it drinks like one. But the definition of fortified wine is a wine that at a certain point during its fermentation or aging process, they add distilled alcohol to it to actually make the wine more stable, to age longer, and to perhaps stop the fermentation process early to leave more sugar in the wine. Now with sherry, almost none of your sweeter sherries is that the case. They're not adding sugar early enough during the fermentation process to preserve sugar. The sherries we're going to taste tonight are dry. Are there sweeter sherries? Yes, there absolutely are, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But let's jump over to our map cam here real fast, and let's talk about where we are in the world. Now, we are in Spain. Down here is Gibraltar, here is Seville, and here is the port of Cadiz. And right through here is the sherry region, right around the town of Jerez, or anglicized sherry. We're going to talk a little bit about the region of Montilla as well. But this is the part of the world we are in, only in southern sherry. Now, sherry is like champagne. I'm going to get rid of the map now. Like champagne, sherry has, since the 1990s, been a legally protected term. If you're going to be making sherry, it has to come from Spain. I apologize if that's a little on the loud side. I'm not sure exactly what's going on out there. So your sherries, for the most part, are dry. There are, of course, sweetened sherries. Yeah, we have a curtain drawn, but it is, after all, just a curtain. There are, of course, sweetened sherries, which we'll get to with the cream sherries. In fact, let's talk about those very briefly right now. So all of your sherries, they are made from 2 or maybe 3 different grapes. The primary one is Palomino, and there are 2 forms of Palomino. Palomino Fino, which is the best of them, and the now steeply in decline Palomino Basto. Palomino Basto was very common until the mid-1970s, but as we're going to talk about in a little while, the sherry industry has been in such steep decline that presently there's about 6,800 hectares of sherry vines in the world, which is way less than a third of what there was in the 1970s. So when they started ripping up all of those sherry vines in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the predominant vine that they were ripping out was the Palomino Basto, which was not the best of the sherry grapes. So, what do we have in our glasses right now? We have the Pepe, Fino, and Rama. Now, Rama is a sub-style of Fino, and there are a couple of 3 of those. So, what is a Fino sherry? Well, when we are making sherry, we start out with this very pale, very neutral grape. Palomino doesn't taste like a whole heck of a lot. Of all the grapes out there, maybe Pecorino is the closest in quality and flavor. It really is a grape that on its own, right out of the vineyard, no matter what you do with it in the vineyard, it tastes like very, very little. And as a result, unless you're trying to make sherry-style wines or fortified wines, there really isn't a lot of Palomino in California or Australia or around the world. Now, winemaking is always changing. If you'd told me 15 years ago that the best wine I was going to have like this year was going to be a Welsh Riesling, I wouldn't have believed it, but here we are. Welsh Riesling has been completely reinvented. We might see a day where Palomino becomes, or Palomino Fino at least, becomes a really, really high-end like table grape variety or table wine grape variety. Table grapes are ones you eat. I don't think we're going to see it, but we'll get there. It's not my volume, it's the fact we had somebody really loud at the cash register who was shouting a little bit. And I do have the neck mic, so we don't pick up a lot of background noise, but yeah, we get a little bit of that. So what makes this different from, say, our Amontillado here or our Oloroso? Well, that is to do with floor. And for that, we're going to jump over to my super janky model that I built just a little earlier tonight. So this is, in fact, a bottle of really, really bad Hutterite wine that we got gifted a few months ago, and some styrofoam chips that I cut into smaller pieces. So what this is modeling is how the sherry actually ages in the barrel. So you will have the barrel about 5/6 full to allow some air to actually exist over top, and then you will have this growth of a variety of different yeasts on top called the floor. Now, floor is a living thing. It's not a hard, permanent crust that doesn't change. In summer, when the sherry aging facility gets a little bit hotter, the floor will actually die back quite substantially. You'll get much, much less of it. It'll look, maybe a little bit of a thin skin of it. And then as it gets colder again, the floor will grow back up. And what this is doing is this creating a hard, protective layer of yeast, effectively, that blocks out air from impacting the wine. And when you're making a Fino sherry, this is how the wine will age. Now, as a result, the sherry itself actually ages for quite some time, up to 5 years, maybe 8 years on a Fino. They can go longer, but that's uncommon. And you get a very, very fresh tasting wine that hasn't been heavily oxidized because of that protective lower layer of floor. The Welsh Riesling that I had that absolutely blew my mind a few weeks ago is the Strekov Welsh Riesling from the Czech Republic. Absolutely spectacular. So, what is in our glasses? This is a very pale sherry that has been aged for a time underneath this protective layer of floor. It hasn't been allowed to oxidize heavily in the barrel. It's made from a not desperately interesting grape variety, but through this process of aging in the barrel, and these are very neutral barrels. These are not like Scotch barrels where they use them the first, second, third, fourth time because they want a lot of that wood flavor. Sherry barrels are used sometimes for centuries in order to preserve as much of a neutral barrel flavor as they can, and also because this floor yeast, it will, when they actually take the sherry out to actually bottle it, they will have that leftover floor in there. So when they add fresh juice or fresh sherry to this, it will have that early inoculation on top of it. So why go to this process? Why make wine like this? Well, that goes back a little bit to the history of why we drink sherry and when we drink sherry. So sherry is, as a fortified wine, a very, very stable product. Once it's actually in the barrel and it has its protective layer of floor, because it has alcohol added to it, because it's seen some oxidation, it's very stable. Heat really can't hurt it too much. A little bit of salt water, like if you were shipping it, say, in an old wooden ship to the Americas or to Britain, that really doesn't hurt it as much as it would like a very delicate, light white wine or even a red wine if you're shipping it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas in, say, the late 15th century. Because of that really, really heavily stable, preserved style of this wine, it was really the first internationally exported wine in the world. The Portuguese, of course, came along very shortly afterwards with port, and of course Madeira and Marsala as well. But all of these were really produced because they were stable for long-term transport and because they were really delicious. Now, fresh Fino sherry is bracing, and it's salty, and it's olivey, and you always get pine nuts. It's powerful, but it's powerful without being sweet. It's aromatic without being like explosive. You don't get the grapefruit and green bell pepper and everything that just blows out of a New Zealand Sauv Blanc. You don't have that butterscotch and baked apple and cinnamon that you get out of a Chardonnay. This is just powerful, but it's powerful with all savory, nutty, earthy flavors. Now, would you have, a glass of sherry with your roast beef dinner? No, it's not designed for that. But imagine this with like a charcuterie plate, or imagine this with just nuts and maybe dried fruit after a meal even. Fino sherries are by far the most approachable. And I do want to talk very briefly about the other two styles of pale sherry. Now, Fino sherries are the predominant style, and the other two are really based off of Fino sherry. You also have manzanilla and pale cream sherry. Now, manzanilla, there are three main sherry cities, and their names are really complicated, so I wrote them down. There is, of course, Jerez de la Frontera, there's Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and there's El Puerto de Santa Maria. And they form more or less a triangle of those three cities. Well, cities, towns, villages in one case. They're very, very small, but all of sherry is contained within that little area. Now, manzanilla is a sub-style of Fino, and that has to be made in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is not a name I really like saying. It tends to be even saltier than the others. It tends to have even more of that green olive and lemon zest character to it, and it can only be made there. The other style, perhaps the less interesting style, Kevin, that's an excellent point. We'll get to that in a second. The other style is pale cream sherry. Now, this is still sherry. It does have to be made in and around the city of Jerez or the other two villages. But with this, they'll start out with a Fino base, and then they'll add either very, very concentrated grape juice, which we call like rectified grape sugar, or they will add just muscat wine to just sweeten it up and brighten it up. This was the style that really was predominant through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This was the #1 style that was exported to Great Britain. This is the style of sherry that I sell to effectively no one under the age of 75 years old. This is very much the reason that we now think of sherry as being, one, very sickly sweet, and two, really kind of an older person's drink, is because of Crofts and because of its evil cousin, Harvey's Bristol Cream, which is the exact same idea, except it's a little bit darker. It has probably more like an Oloroso base than a Fino base. Now, that's not to say that the Crofts doesn't have some of these same notes. It will still have that nuttiness. It will still have some of that olive brine. I actually had Crofts about 6-7 weeks ago. I actually was at somebody's house, and they had a bottle of Crofts on the bar, and I actually got to try it, and I was like, you know what? That's better than I thought it would be. It's still not great, but it's a lot better than I expected it to be. But anytime you see the word cream on a sherry, it means sweetened. This really tastes like vermouth to me, is the comment that Kevin made that I wanted to come back to. There's actually quite a few vermouth companies that actually base their vermouths in sherry. I actually have one of those right here, González Bias, which is one of the largest sherry makers on earth. They actually make some really fantastic vermouths. So that's a thing that you can get very easily. We also sell vermouths made by Alvear and a couple of other sherry houses. Sherry is a very traditional base for a vermouth. And yeah, it has this uniquely musty aroma that I think the first time you maybe have a Fino sherry, it's maybe a little bit off-putting, but more than anything, it reminds me of the koji character, the very unique starch-converting fungus that they use in sake making to convert the complex starches in rice into simple sugars for fermentation. There's a real commonality in aroma and flavor between koji and the floor in making sherry. So that was an absolutely monstrous amount of information to dump on all of you all at once. I imagine we are going to have some questions because I covered an absolutely monstrous amount of ground very, very quickly. So let's go back to talking about the floor here. And if you want to get me back on floor cam here, Aaron.
Back on floor cam.
Thank you very much. Yep. Now, floor, as a rule, is very, very, very picky. Floor, so when they've harvested the grapes fresh, and it doesn't matter whether it's Palomino Fino or if it is Pedro Jimenez, it's coming out of the vineyard at a potential alcohol when it's finished being made into very dry, very neutral wine of about 11 or 12% alcohol. Now with sherry, that won't actually allow the floor to form. The floor is very, very picky. If the alcohol is too high, over 16%, floor won't form at all. If the alcohol is under about 14.5, the floor won't grow either. So it has to be right between 14.5 and 16, and depending on exactly the formulation of the grapes you got going into it. For example, Pero Jimenez likes a little bit more alcohol versus Palomino Fino likes a little less. You will actually really have to adjust your alcohol to get this perfect floor formation. So a Fino, we've already discussed, this is a wine that spends its entire time maturing underneath this protective floor, so it keeps its nice pale color, and it keeps that really nice fresh aroma. Well, what if you kind of aged your sherry here for a period, maybe a year, maybe a decade, and then at some point in its aging, you added just enough alcohol to bring it up over that magic 16% number so that the floor died. So now most of its time aging has been spent aging without oxygen like a Fino, and then you've added just a dribble of alcohol just to bring it over 16, and now it's going to spend some time aging with the air touching it, with the air right on top of the wine, darkening the wine, oxidating it, giving it really rich, kernely, nutty characters. Well, that is what we call Amontillado. What makes up the floor? The floor is a variety of different yeasts. Some of it is in fact Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which we know is like traditional wine yeast or beer yeast, but there's also a huge variety of wild yeasts. Not actually including Brettanomyces, because we don't get any acetic acid, we don't get any kind of horse blanket notes out of this. So this isn't the same sort of wild yeast you'd use for like a lambic or something. They're not the same style of wild yeast as that. So the first thing we notice when we get into the Marqués de POLEY here, we are changing, for one, from Palomino Fino grapes into Pero Jimenez grapes. That is unusual for an Amontillado. And then we get this much darker color. Now, I do want to point out one really important thing on this label. Right down at the bottom here, it says Solera 1922. And I'll jump back over to Sherry diagram cam here for a minute. I'll talk about the Solera system and how it works. I don't know what the cam's called, Aaron, don't yell at me. So this is my really, really awful diagram that I made this afternoon. Please do make fun of my artistic skills, like how this barrel's apparently floating in space. So this is how we make sherry. Now let's just say this is a very simple criadera, and the very last barrel here is, you know, the one that we're going to take wine out of. So if we were making this, say, we would be taking about, at most, a third of this barrel out and bottling it. Well, now this barrel's a little too empty. Well, how do we top it up? We top it up from here to here and all the way down to the last barrel in the criadera, the young barrel. Now, that's where we take that fresh crushed juice that's been, you know, fortified up to around 15% alcohol, and we add that here. So in theory, you know, would say if we were draining all these barrels completely to the bottom, this would be a 6-year-old. But we're not. We're only taking a third out at a time. And if this Solera was, say, started in 1922, well, there's a percentage, granted a tiny percentage, but a percentage of that original 1922 wine still in that last barrel. Now, the wine doesn't die because we're continually topping up with just enough young wine to keep it alive as part of the Solera system. So that last barrel will keep its floor, it will provide enough sugar and enough yeast nutrients that the floor won't die, so the barrel will stay stable for a very long time, centuries in fact. But yeah, we can create an average age over this Solera of about 35 years old, but there's some tiny drop in your glass right now that's the original 1922 founding wine, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. And virtually every sherry is made like this.
Cool.
So, I'm glad you enjoyed that, Aaron.
Actually cool.
Yeah.
Science.
Science. So that's the Amontillado method. You notice this one's actually quite high in alcohol at 21%. That's likely to give it some shelf stability. It's not completely unheard of to have a little bit of alcohol added to the sherry, especially older ones like this that are 35 years old going into the bottle. And I do want to talk very briefly about, you know, value in sherry. Remember how I talked about, you know, the sherry plantings today are less than a third of what they were in the 1970s? Sherry prices haven't exactly stayed very high. I know Craig has a pretty good idea of what a 35-year-old bottle of scotch would cost, and it's getting up towards $1,000. That's $39.95 all day long because sherry prices are so incredibly depressed. But okay, we talked about Amontillado. You start out with a Fino, and you add a little bit of alcohol to encourage the floor to die back. Well, there's two other styles of Amontillado. We'll talk about this one first, what we call fake Amontillado or medium sherry. Now, happily, the word Amontillado has started disappearing off of these labels, but brands like Dry Sack, Walnut Brown, Nutty Solera, there was a bunch of them. They're all kind of 16, 18 bucks. They're all around 20% alcohol, and they're all basically fake Amontillados. They would be very, very young Olorosos with a bit of sugar added. They weren't as sweet as a true cream sherry, but they were definitely made in that same system as a cream sherry. The other system is, I kept going on about the deliberateness of adding alcohol to this. Well, there's another way. On very, very, very rare occasions, less than 2% of all sherry produced does this happen. You will start out making a Fino, and then as you're aging it naturally, the floor will start dying back on its own. And that creates the absolute rarest type of sherry, which is known as Palo Cortado. You might notice this is a 1955. It's the only Palo Cortado I had in the store. We just brought it in. And again, sherry prices, insanely low. This is $325 for something from the actual 1950s, which is nuts. Palo Cortados, we don't have them through the store very often. For the Alberta market, we get one kind of every other year. I do try to pick them up when I can find them because I really like them. They're like an Amontillado, but even saltier, even richer. And some of those kind of burnt caramel nutty aromas aren't as incredibly pronounced as they are in a true Amontillado. That said, I mean, it has this like burnt sugar, like the top of a creme brulee, but without any sweetness to it. It's just nutty and cooked sugary and rich. And it's a very natural product. They're not adding caramel to this. This is just what happens when you age a wine very carefully for 35 years while slowly transferring it between barrels to keep the flavor fresh. Nuts for sure. I could see something that mineral oil. I think kerosene would be a little more sulfuric than this. I get more like mineral oil or gun oil as my kind of oiliness. It's a little cleaner than kerosene. And I get raisins and dates and sultanas. I get all my dried and cooked fruits. I get some citrus and lemon, but it's like almost like preserved lemon or almost marmalade. I get that burnt sugar. And then in the mouth, yeah, Christmas pudding, figs, dates, ginger, actually quite a bit of ginger, which is really fun. Just, yeah, really a Christmas pudding style of thing, but without the sugar. Now, this is a very challenging wine. You can understand that to reach a broad audience, why they might have felt that this, plus a little bit of sugar, would reach a broader audience, and they were right. But what happened for sherry, at least in North America, is the same thing that happened to the German wine industry coming out of the 1980s. California Cabernet, California Chardonnay, and Chilean Merlot happened. And everyone went from drinking light, sweet German Riesling, sherry, all of these lovely sweet things to saying, you know what? I'm done with sugar for the next 35 years. I think I'm just going to drink Cabernet, Shiraz, Merlot, Chardonnay, and Sauv Blanc, and anything that isn't bone dry, I'm not interested in. Happily, we're starting to come out of that, and happily the Spanish have started, well, not even started, just this is 20 years ago, they really got better at exporting some of the more traditional styles, and they also got better at making more of the traditional styles. For a lot of the sherry houses, they got way too used to making these kind of commercially sweetened examples, and they almost had to relearn to make their original heritage styles, which was a bit of a shame. But sherry right now has never been better, it's never been cheaper, and it's finally getting cool again. One of the things I noticed when I was in California last summer was I'd go to like California wine bars where the whole list was Californian. They maybe had like a bottle of Taylor's Fladgate's late bottle vintage on the bar, but they'd have a 15 sherry list because everybody who cared enough about wine to go to a wine bar loved sherry and would order it after they had finished everything else. Okay, so let's go on to our last style here, the Oloroso. This is a 15-year Oloroso. Again, this is a average because it's done in the Solera system. So the average age coming out of that last barrel is 15 year. It's not like a Scotch. It's not a minimum. It's an average of 15. This is made by El Maestro Sierra. And again, like, this is a 15-year-old and it's $19.95 on the shelf. Granted for a half bottle, but still. Silly cheap. And here, this is where, when they put it into the barrel, they take the alcohol up to 16.5 or even 17. They don't want to encourage any floor growth whatsoever. They want complete oxidative aging. They don't want any protective floor growth at all. They just want this intensely nutty, kernely, fully oxidative style of making wine. They don't want any of that sherry floor character. They just want oxidation. And I absolutely love Oloroso. So in the winery, by far the hottest style in terms of alcohol. They usually put it in some of the hotter parts of the warehouse in order to encourage as much oxidation as they can. It's good with Smarties. You know, that might actually work in a. I'm thinking almost like in the sense that peanut M&Ms work. This would almost be like the peanut in a peanut M&M with Smarties. And here I get introduced like maple notes. I get vanilla. I almost get something in the soy sauce family. No, not soy. More like Worcester. Like sweet chewing tobacco sort of thing, or pipe tobacco. I could just smell this all day. I really like Oloroso. It does have really, now one thing you'll notice on all of these, it has really, really, really high acidity. And that's because both Palomino Fino and Pedro Jimenez, despite being basically baked in the sun in one of the hottest parts of Spain, we're just barely north of Gibraltar. It is hot as anything. We're right on the Mediterranean. Technically, no, we're not. We're on the other side of the peninsula, so we're actually right on the southern Atlantic. It's hot as anything. And it's creating these really, really intense white wines that all have really high acidity because white grape varieties that originally come from very, very hot climates naturally have very high acidity, especially from Spain. Now, of course, there's other examples out there. Grillo from Sicily, Assyrtiko from southern Greece, and of course, kind of the big three cava grapes within Spain in Macabeo, Parellada, and Xarel·lo. Those are all really, really high acid grape varieties. But this is something even a little bit more different. This is something where these are wines that are not grown for aroma. They're not grown for flavor. They're not grown for having really great mouthfeel. They're grown for having enough alcohol to make the sherry work and have crushingly high acidity, which is not like any other wine industry on earth. And that's how they really give you these incredibly pretty Finos. And then I would say more the age gives you some of these other styles. But yeah, oh yeah, fig I could see for days. Which is interesting because I actually don't like figs, but I like it in sherry. Well, we got through the technical part of that fast, didn't we? Let's talk a little bit about what we have coming up next, and then I'll kind of answer questions about this. So let's talk about what beer tasting is not coming up this Wednesday. After the beer tasting on Wednesday night, Aaron and I went to shoot the promo for next week's beer tasting. And we realized Wednesday is Remembrance Day. And I'm totally not going to do a beer tasting on Remembrance Day because that's disrespectful, so we are pushing that a week. However, next Friday, a week from today, we are going ahead with our Scotch tasting. Our Scotch tasting is Bruichladdich, hosted by, thank you, hosted by myself, of course, and then co-hosted by the National Brand Ambassador, Reed Pettit, in charge of the Bruichladdich portfolio for Southern Glazers of Canada. So, just like last time we did a Scotch tasting, these are heavily discounted. You're going to get the Bruichladdich Barley Collection set. Did I remember to take the booklet out? I did not. You're going to get the Barley Collection kit here. Thank you. Which gets you the beer barley, the organic barley, and the Islay barley, a little 200 ml of each, and that's going to be $80 all in, just like our traditional wine tastings are. And then in addition, I'm doing deep discounts on the Bruichladdich Classic Laddie down at $59.95. And then finally the Port Charlotte Isla Barley, which we have down at $79.95. So really, really fun little thing. If nothing else, get the little kit here because that's going to be so much fun. Bruichladdich is so particular about their barley, and all of these different versions of it, all they're changing is the barley strain. And it's so interesting how different they all taste. These days we're seeing, you know, all sorts of distilleries working with heritage strains. Glenmorangie did their beer barley strain. Ben Romick has an organic line now. There's lots of people playing around with barley now, but Bruichladdich were really the first ones, and that'll be a really interesting conversation to have. So that is coming up a week from today, and then 2 Wednesdays from now, so the 18th of November, we are going ahead with our regularly scheduled beer tasting just a week later than usual. And this week it is West Coast Best Coast. We finally have a good enough lineup of West Coast IPAs that I can actually do a proper West Coast IPA tasting and a little bit of a history of IPA in Alberta. Now, for those of you who've been to enough of our beer tastings, you know, I'm always talking about Tree Hophead and how good it used to be. I tried to get Tree Hophead for this. I actually couldn't find any. There wasn't any in Alberta. So we can't do that. So we're going to have to kind of set our clocks back kind of 5 years into the future after Tree Hophead to when Red Racer first comes out and really gets the IPA ball rolling in Alberta. And then we'll talk about Fat Tug and my slightly silly efforts to kind of get a going supply out of BC by mail from my friend who lived there. And then finally we'll talk about some modern examples, the Cabin Seasons Past West Coast IPA, and the Reinhard Armden Citra West Coast Pale Ale. So that is our IPA retrospective / return to the West Coast little tasting for beer, and that is on November the 18th. I'm just going to put this back very quickly. Do we... Oh, let's start at the top. Do ports also come from Spain? No, ports come from Portugal, specifically from the city and area of Oporto, which is the city at the very mouth of the Douro River Valley in Portugal. The grapes, of course, are grown all the way up the Douro Valley, which is a really wide valley. They run riverboat tours and big boats all the way up that river and then back down. And you can go and visit all these really cool wineries up and down the Douro Valley. But yeah, port comes from Porto, which is the name of the city at the mouth of the Douro Valley in Portugal. Do we sell a lot of sherries in the store? No, we absolutely don't. We carry probably far more sherry in the store than we ought to, but Devin and I are both hardcore sherry nerds, so we really, really like it. We sell more sherry than we really ought to, but we still don't exactly sell a lot of sherry. There are some stores in Calgary, Vinerts in particular, that actually sell buckets of sherry, Metro Vino as well, go through absolute mountains of sherry compared to what we go through, but we do okay. We sell more than we should, considering that sherry, at least in North America, is effectively a dead style. I'd love to do a port tasting. That would be fun. And it does seem like we do have to do ports now. Probably not, you know, immediately, but we do need to get to ports quite soon. No, Kevin, you would probably die if you drank all of this tonight. Please don't do that. We like your comments on the videos. These will last a varying amount of time. So we've had these open for about a week here in the store. I'd say we've had these open since Wednesday of last week, so about 10 days. The Tio Pepe and Rama here, and Rama, by the way, means natural or unfiltered. I don't think I actually got to that when I was talking about it. Tio Pepe is the largest Fino brand on earth. They sell more of it than anyone else by miles. Rama is their unfiltered, kind of more organic style of it. I think it's got a little more body to it, a little more richness. And it's like $2 more than regular Tio Pepe, so why not do this? This in the fridge should last 8 to 12 weeks, in your kitchen cupboard 3 to 5. This being kind of an average age of 35 years, even in your fridge, I'd give this about a month. The 15-year Oloroso, because this is aged its whole time in the presence of oxygen, it's done all the oxidating it's really good to do. If you want to put this like in a cool place, like in your basement bar, 2 years, it's really not going to change much. The sherry aftertaste is like a saltwater ocean. Yeah, it really is. It's got this beautiful, like, mild saltiness that just is absolutely spectacular. Yeah, go right ahead, Aaron. It's something.
This is my favorite.
You love that Oloroso? Yeah, the Oloroso is really neat. I'd love to hear favorites from everybody else. The trick about only having 3 wines is we do tend to burn through them quite quickly. So I'd love to hear, like, what was your favorite? Do you have any questions? Because we burn through a lot of content very quickly here. Oh, and we're at the eeny, meeny, miny, mo of sherry here for me. I'm going to do the Fino. Oh, one other interesting point I did forget to mention, something that I didn't know until I actually started doing my research here. When you go to the grocery store and you see sherry vinegar on the shelves, that's very often not a deliberate product that they were trying to make. That was a sherry cask that lost its alcohol. So remember how I said, like, the floor needs to be at least 14% to actually form? Well, if your alcohol, for whatever reason, at some point during its aging process dips much below 14, certainly anything below 13.5, the sherry completely destabilizes and it turns into sherry vinegar. So your sherry vinegar isn't like, you know, slightly soured sherry on purpose to make it for the grocery store. Most of it's just sherry that doesn't work out because one day they walk in and they taste the barrel and it's turned to vinegar. It's actually something that happens. 3-1-2. Craig, you're breaking my heart. 3-2-1. Okay, the Oloroso is going to be a winner. 3-2-1 for both. Is it better to open for a bit before drinking? It's going to change. When I first opened the Amontillado here 10 days ago, it drank, and I've had this not in the fridge, I've had this just kicking around underneath the tasting bar here. It drank a lot more like the Tío Pepe, and as it has sat at room temperature under the counter here, it has slowly moved more towards an Oloroso as it has oxidized more. Depends what you like. Do I find white wine drinkers prefer sherry and red wine drinkers like port? I'll be honest, I don't know that we've actually usually sold enough sherry to really say. I'll put it this way. Sherry as a category sells to kind of both ends of the bell curve. People who really don't know anything about wine, but really like Harvey's Bristol Cream at one end, and people who are just the biggest wine nerds on planet Earth are super sherry geeks almost universally. Port's kind of everybody else in the middle. People who, you know a bit about wine, they care about wine, they know the difference between a Cabernet and a Chardonnay, maybe they have a bit of a cellar at home. They tend to be port people. Sherry people either just run into it randomly and fall in love with it kind of in the middle of their journey, which is more or less what I'm trying to do to all of you tonight, or it's something that people come to very, very late. I certainly came to it very late. I've been working here for 20 years. I really only ever got into sherry. I always liked sherry, and I understood it was a little underappreciated, but I never really loved it. I only really fell in love with sherry like 3 years ago, so it came very, very late for me. No one likes the Fino. It's the Millhouse of sherry. Well, no, it's not. It's actually a lot of people's favorite. Now, I will actually make an interesting point here. This was something that I was hoping somebody else would actually notice. Does anybody see the word sherry on the Marqués de POLEY? Do they see the word Jerez or sherry, or do they just see Amontillado? Now, Amontillado is recognized as one of the major grades of sherry. It's important. It's, along with Fino and Oloroso, like one of the big 3 in terms of global sales. Is probably number 2 right behind Fino. But Amontillado literally means in the style of Montilla. Now, remember when I was right at the start showing you that map and I said, oh, here's the city of Montilla, it's going to be important. Well, the city of Montilla is about 220 kilometers inland of Jerez. And it's not technically sherry. Until the very late 80s, I believe they actually were allowed to use the word sherry on the label. But Montilla is actually its own very sherry adjacent wine industry. They still use Pero Jimenez and Palomino. They still use the Solera method. They don't have the coastal influence because they're not right on the ocean. They are landlocked. But yeah, Amontillado is in the style of a Montilla, which is actually a very closely related but different style of fortified wine from Spain. So this is actually a Montilla and not a sherry. I snuck one by you. Will the first mix well with gin or vodka? The absolute greatest martini in the world is one where you actually glaze the inside of the glass with Fino sherry rather than with olive brine. It's spectacular. The other really great thing, and I learned this when I went to Daytona Beach, Florida, and I went to a seafood restaurant. Apparently in certain parts of the East Coast, if you're getting clam chowder, any kind of seafood chowder, they'll actually bring to your table like a little vinegar bottle of Fino sherry for you to add to your broth because it does such wonderful things for the actual broth of the soup. So that was something I learned too. I know whenever I do make a cream-based soup, I do add probably too much Fino sherry, but I like the flavor, so I just add as much as I like. Ooh, Elizabeth has a brilliant question. Is there a difference between the old malt cask approach and apothec's in terms of just getting product and blending it? Yes, there is. With old malt cask's approach, they're buying the whiskey, generally speaking, as young as they can. So the whiskey hasn't had a chance to be put into the wrong barrel or put in a bad warehouse or be already artificially sweetened or already cut. They can then take this base spirit and they can put it into a really good barrel, put it in a properly temperature and humidity controlled warehouse, or not controlled like you're putting on a Seacoast so it can really breathe and get all that sea air into it. They can actually make sure it's not chill filtered. They can make sure it has no caramel added. They can do all of the best things for it. And they always have the option that if they don't like what comes out of it after 8, 10, 20 years, they can just sell it off for blending. With apothec, it's the other way. Apothec has a certain price per ton for grapes that they are willing to pay so that they can sell it at what they sell it for. And it really doesn't matter what it is as long as it's red and not completely rotted through. It could be Cabernet, Merlot, Zin, Valdigues, doesn't matter. As long as it's red, they'll chuck it in apothec red and they'll fix it all in post. They'll artificially acidify, they'll vacuum distill, they'll chaptalize by adding sugar if they have to. They'll do everything they have to monkey with that wine enough that it hits their flavor profile. Old malt cask's approach is starting with something very raw and then babysitting it until it becomes something great. Apothec's Red's idea is starting out with what this is going to taste like and taking whatever base ingredients come through the back door and just messing with them. And I'm being very dismissive here. This is incredibly difficult winemaking to actually do. It's perhaps more difficult than making like a really passable $25 red, is to turn absolute garbage into apothec red. It's garbage in, garbage out, but it's a different sort of garbage. But yeah, it's starting with your known end product and then adjusting your base ingredients to fit that, rather than starting with a very raw base ingredient and then adjusting your process to allow that base ingredient to shine through. I hope that makes sense. Apothec is industrial chemistry. I think I actually was slightly meaner than that, but not lots. Okay, folks, unless we have any more questions, I realize it's a little bit of a shorter one for us, but we only had 3 wines this week. And I really hope that you enjoyed that, because I had a lot of fun. You let me really kind of stretch my wine nerd muscles and really get into something I was super interested in. As I said at the start, I made this terrible diorama of a sherry barrel. I made an awful chart. I had to get out the maps. I had to make notes. I thoroughly enjoyed how much I had to work for this. And I'm going to try to do more where I actually have to really dig in to the formal wine education side to actually give you some quality content. So this was fun. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you did as well. Enjoy the rest of your Friday night. I'm going to try and get home before the roads freeze. For Andrew Hilton, I'm Kyle. That was Aaron.
Hi.
Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Good night.